In this video, I'd like to talk about the thing that I've been seeing a lot. I've always seen this a lot on the internet, on forums, on even just casual conversations between people. Whenever they talk about the state of the world, it's always typically people take one of two positions, either that what we have now is the best system we could possibly get, and it's just a matter of fixing things within the system, and that at its core, it's a legitimate system. It's a legitimate thing that we're living under. And then on the other hand, you have people who say that, oh, it's rotten to the core, and it's all capitalism that is to blame for all of society's woes. And it just so happens that somebody of my persuasion isn't going to take either of those sides. They're going to try to explain the actual problem at its root. So when people converse about capitalism, more often than not, they actually have a lackluster knowledge and an incorrect view of what that word actually means. So if you're a person of leftist persuasion, communist, a liberal, a what have you, left-wing type of person, you're typically going to adopt a sort of cynical view of what capitalism actually is. And you're going to tend to blame all of the social woes on greed, on capitalism, and on corporations. Well, the issue with that sort of belief is that what the person tends to think, what the person tends to believe, is that corporations are a product of actual capitalism, which I don't think is the case at all, because if you take into account what corporations actually are, they're simply companies that are granted extra rights by government. And it's not really nothing more than that. It's just all the corporation is a legal entity, and then that government ascribes certain rules and rights to that legal entity for the purposes of, any sort of legal action. And that just right off the bat is a clear indication that that's not a product of a free market. In a truly free market, there is no such thing, and in a truly free society, there's no such thing as having a company with extra rights or a company with less rights than another company or whatever. That just simply doesn't exist. And so right off the bat, if we were to take the view of capitalism being what I actually think capitalism is, and what I think objectively is the true definition of capitalism, which is simply free markets and the ability of each individual to voluntarily and freely exchange products and resources with other individuals within a market. That definition of capitalism is at odds with the definition that most people tend to think. And the definition that most people tend to think is capitalism is actually not. It's actually crony-capitalism. The more accurate way of defining what we actually have, what we actually live under, is crony-capitalism and corporatism. So like I mentioned before, corporations not being an actual product of a free market, you can't then therefore say that the nasty things that corporations do, the environmental things, the financial schemes, the etc. so forth, whatever it is that people attack capitalism for, that could be ascribed to corporatism and crony-capitalism a lot more accurately. Now, what is the difference between capitalism and crony-capitalism and corporatism? Well, like I mentioned before, corporations are purely a product of the state. They wouldn't exist without government. They wouldn't exist without the state. When it comes to crony-capitalism, that idea revolves around the idea of what's called regulatory capture. And what regulatory capture is essentially you have large, multinational corporations with a whole lot of leverage, whose individual board members tend to go into and out of positions on the board of the corporations in which they work, and they happen to also go into positions of they're in the regulatory apparatus of the government. And what happens is there's basically just a revolving door of people going from the regulatory positions within government to the corporations and back, which very clearly results in a conflict of interest where the people that go into those positions after being in these corporations have a vested interest in passing regulations that are beneficial to the corporations themselves. And then as a result, you get, the absolute horrendous corruption that ensues. That, once again, is not a product of free markets, and is not a product of true, actual, legitimate capitalism, because it involves government, and it involves the corruption, the natural corruption that ensues when you have a massive organization that has a monopoly on the use of violence against an entire continent worth of people. So, again, something like that, where you have one regulatory apparatus, one exclusive regulatory apparatus with a monopoly, that then gets obviously corrupted by people with the most amount of money and steered in the direction of whatever the corporations and the banks want, that would not exist in the absence of that one monopolized regulatory apparatus. If you had an actual free market where any company could join in on the idea of regulation and keeping products safe and and fighting corruption and any of those things that are, again, positively ascribed to the existence of government by people who believe in government, none of the negative things that you see in the system that we live under today would exist in an actual free market system in the absence of this one centralized, coercive organization. And people will obviously come up with arguments against that. Well, it would be for a free-for-all. It would be every man for himself. And oh my gosh, can you imagine but these people who come up with these arguments or immediately jump quickly to contradict the idea that maybe we should be free, maybe we should not have this one giant, mega organization that has the exclusive right to utilize violence against us. Maybe we should be absent of that. The people who cry the loudest about that, the people who are most upset about that, they tend to take all of the negative things, all of the negative aspects of living under the system, and they sweep it aside because, I mean, it's mostly fear. It's mostly people who are afraid of legitimate change. They're afraid of ultimately the responsibility that would take place in the event that true freedom were to come about. Because there would be a lot more responsibility at that point. But what people like to do is they like to throw that responsibility aside and say, no, I want these people to be in charge of whatever, in charge of making decisions. And that's where I feel like this huge disconnect comes into play, where people are confused in terms. They don't recognize the difference between capitalism and crony-capitalism and corporatism, because it all just morphs into one big entity that they can shake their finger at and blame. But anyways, I'm kind of rambling now at this point, but point being, capitalism is often misconstrued, and it's not what most people think it is, and it's not the problem. So thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.